Hi everyone, it's Kai with SeriousWatches, and today I'm joined by Connor behind the camera, and we're going to be talking about watch complications. I'm not going to say the complicated matter because that's very cheesy, but we're going to be discussing some of the different watch complications. Now, watch complication is basically a feature on a movement that is not related to, say, the 2 or 3 hands indicating the time, but rather an extra feature. Now, there's quite a few complications, and I won't pretend that we'll discuss all of them, but we'll go through a couple that we have in our collection. And if you're new to watches and want to find out a little bit more, you may wonder what is a power reserve, what is a chronograph, and we'll go through them and we'll be ranking them. We'll be ranking them based on usefulness and on coolness. Now, obviously, Connor thought that I was the best person to rank things based on coolness, so I thought that was a great idea. Don't laugh, Connor.
Questionable.
Oi. So we'll be going through all the different complications, and we've got some watches lined up, and we'll show them to you, and we'll rank them. The first complication that we'll be discussing is the date complication. Now, this is a complication that you've probably heard of. It's on a lot of watches, I would say well over 50%, and usually it's in the shape and form of a aperture in the dial, usually at 3 o'clock, where you basically have a window that shows you the date, and this date will run from 1 to 31. So if the month has fewer days than 31, you'll need to synchronize it at the beginning of the month. To indicate, I have a watch over here, which I'll show you. Which has a little window at 3 o'clock where you can see the date. Now, obviously, there's different ways to indicate it. Some watches have a hand, an actual extra hand to show the date. So there's some different complications, well, different ways of showing the date.
I guess you get some day windows as well, which not only will show today's date, but also yesterday and tomorrow. But
yeah,
obviously
they just show more of the date wheel because it's like a wheel that's in on the movement, and it will just show more. But then again, whether that's,
if you know today's date, you know what it was.
Yeah,
yesterday
I mean,
tomorrow.
if that's your difficulty, not being sure what comes after 15, well, yeah, you may not be really eligible to buy a watch in the first place.
Very true. Very true.
So in terms of practicality, is it practical? I would say yes, it's rather practical, because, you know, if you work at an office, you frequently need to date things, and sure, it's on your phone, it's on your PC, whatever, but it's still practical to know the date. So we rather agree at the office that this would be a 7.5 in terms of our new practicality scale. Is it cool? Well, not really. I mean, it's not sort of the complication that you show off to your friends, like, oh, look at me, I've got a date window. No, that's not really true. So we thought the date would be a 3 in terms of coolness. The next complication is the day complication. It's somewhat related to the date complication. It's usually, there's very few watches that just have a day indicator. Quite frankly, I can't think of a watch that doesn't have a date but does have a day indicator. Similarly to the date, it's usually an aperture in the dial where it will show you the day. Usually it's abbreviated to just like Mon rather than Monday. There are some watches, and of course probably you know the Rolex Day Date, which has, like the name says, the date and the date, but rather the day is shown at 12 o'clock. I've got one of the watches that has a little window. At 3 o'clock, showing you the day and the date. In some cases, the day will be available in different languages. I know that some people really like the Japanese ones on JDM Seikos, for example, but in some cases it's available in Spanish and German. So it can be fun to have your local language on your watch. Is it practical? Well, I have to admit that I tend to know what day it is, and I think most people are with me on that. I mean, I'm at the office quite frequently on Saturday, and I don't think I've ever seen someone, aside from myself, show up unannounced, being like, oh, I thought it was Friday. No, so I'm guessing that it's not that much of a big deal to know what day it is. So in terms of practicality, I struggle to give it more than 3 points, really.
I guess with day and date as well, it's the kind of thing that now you can literally just pull out your phone and I mean, you don't even have to unlock it on your lock screen. It will have the time, the day, the date.
But even then, prior to your phone, I mean, everyone tends to know what day it is.
Course,
I mean, is it cool? I would say it's cooler than a date window. So we're giving that a 5. But even then, it's not really James Dean sort of cool. I would say so. 3 in terms of practicality and a 5 in terms of coolness. Our next complication, which does fit in with the day and the date, is a week indicator. Now, this is not a complication that we see very often. Usually it's the month indicator, where you can actually see the month, but since we had a Junghans watch that actually does have a week indicator, we thought it would be fun to fit it in there. So this watch actually has a separate hand showing you the week number. So it will run from, say, 1 to 52, and it's quite a nifty complication. I'll show it. So at 12 o'clock you actually have a hand indicating you the week number. It's not really one that, again, we see frequently. I just know that Junghans does it, and I'm sure that this particular movement is used by some other brands, but it's not a very common complication. Is it practical? Well, I would say if you work at an office where you need to know the week number, or you have some sort of profession where it's important, yes, that it can be very practical for most people. I mean, looking at myself, I may look it up like once a month, and you just type in Google what week number is it. So it's not the most practical complication in the world. So we're giving that a 5 in terms of practicality, because it can be very practical. If you need to know it a lot, then it may be a higher score than that. But we thought it was not the most practical thing in the world. In terms of coolness, we struggle to really think of it as a very, very cool complication. So I'm thinking, we thought that it would be a 4 out of 10. Again, not a bit geeky perhaps to have an indicator for the week, but it's still a fun complication. It could be a conversation starter, I suppose. Now we're going to move away from the calendar-related complication for a little bit, and we'll move on to the chronograph. Now, the chronograph, again, is a very famous complication. There's a lot of watches with complications, with chronograph complication, and basically it has a timing device where you can press a button and it will register how much time has elapsed, and you can pause it and you can reset it. There's several different versions of chronographs, but we'll just stick to the one that is most commonly found. Again, I have a very cool chronograph watch here, and the chronograph is actually running. And you can actually see the chronograph hand. It just runs like a regular second hand, but the time will register on one of the smaller complex indexes. Now, the chronograph it can be a very practical thing, because you can use it to time anything from say if you're boiling an egg, or your parking meter, to say sports things. Again, most sports these days do not use a watch anymore, but rather professional equipment, but it's still something you can actually use. It's a practical thing. It can be a lot of fun because you're also interacting with your watch, you're pressing buttons and something happens. So this is one where we feel it's both practical and cool. In terms of practicality, we're giving it a 7.5. It can be very practical. It may not be something you use on a daily basis, but it's still practical. It has a function, and it can genuinely be used. In terms of coolness, I mean, who doesn't like a chronograph? Some of the most popular watches in the world are chronographs. Some of the most iconic watches are chronographs. So we're giving it an 8 out of 10 in terms of coolness. It's just a very cool complication, and both practical, so we love a good chronograph.
I would say, would you agree that chronographs can be a bit contradictory on certain watches in the sense, from a more practicality side of things? So, for instance, the Edox that you just showed, the watch also has a bezel, and largely certain mundane activities that you could maybe time with chronograph, you could also time with the bezel, such as how long it's going to take for your pasta to boil or something like that.
Well, you can set the bezel, of course, to a certain time where you want to know, like, oh, at that certain point I need to do something. But chronograph can actually register hours or minutes that have elapsed. So it can be both. You frequently see chronographs again with tachymeters, so you can monitor how quickly you are going, whether or not you want to be looking at your watch when you're driving, possibly say 150 miles an hour.
You're just going to time how fast you're going.
I don't know. Several very famous rock stars have died in car crash. So I don't know if they were perhaps using their chronograph and their tachymeters. I mean, that would be, well, not very healthy. So we don't recommend using your chronograph while driving, but you can do that. Again, tachymeters are not very useful, but in these days, again, if I were to boil an egg, I would usually get my phone and just use the timer on there, but you can do it in a practical sense. The next one we're going to be discussing is the GMT, aka second time zone, which is actually in most cases a third or fourth hand on a watch that indicates time in a different time zone. So you can set it separately. Usually these watches have a 24-hour bezel, so you can keep track of a second time zone. This is especially useful if you have family abroad or friends abroad. I mean, myself, my brother lives in the US, and it's always difficult to know what time it is there, and I'm coming from the UK, so I can imagine that it's practical for you as well.
Yep. For me, not so much. I mean, they're only an hour behind, so.
But still, it's and especially now during Corona when you can't travel anymore, and it's. I mean, it can be nice to know what time your friends and family are in. So, let me just show you a watch with a. GMT hand. This is the Le Jour, which actually has a separate hand that you can set individually from the normal time. So you can set it to whatever time zone you want to keep track of, and it will show you. And you use the 24-hour bezel to see what time they're actually in. So this is a complication that is both practical and it's reasonably cool. So in terms of practicality, especially since we both have family abroad, we've given it an 8. We think it's just something that's very nice. It can be very practical. Of course, you can memorize how many hours they're behind or in front of you, but it's nice to just be able to look at your watch and see what time it is. In terms of coolness, yeah, it's just another hand, so it's not that super spectacular. So we're giving it a 5 in terms of coolness. Not the coolest complication, but a practical one, and one that we both personally enjoy. The next complication we'll be talking about is the power reserve indicator, and this is basically a fuel gauge for your watch, so you can see how many hours of power reserve it still has left. It's quite practical. Well, it used to be very practical before there were automatic watches. Since automatic watches, your watch gets wound whenever you wear it, so you move your hands around this, it will get wound up, and your watch tends to be a full charge if you have a normal basic active life. Without an automatic, you needed to wind your watch, usually once every day or sometimes once every other day, and you never really knew how much power reserve you had left. So that, when a power reserve indicator, would be very practical. For example, this watch, which has some sort of a gauge where if you wind the watch, you'll see that it starts increasing the power reserve. So you can actually see how much reserve it has left, and it increases when you wind the crown, and it will also increase when you use the automatic, well, the automatic rotor. In this day and age, it's it's still a fun complication, but it's not the most practical one in the world, especially if you have a watch winder or whatever. You tend to be sure that it has full charge. So in terms of practicality, we're a bit on the fence. It can be practical, but it's not super practical. So we're giving it a 5 out of 10. And in terms of coolness, it is pretty cool to have a fuel gauge on your watch. I would say that the cool factor is a bit higher, so we're giving it a 7 for the cool factor. The next one we're discussing is the day and night indicator. Sometimes it's shaped in a way of a 24-hour hand, but in our case we're discussing the case where they opted to do usually a sun and a moon to show whether it's day or night. For example, this Orient watch has this particular complication. 4 o'clock, you can see the an aperture where it shows a little sun. So, is this practical? Well, how often are you unsure whether it's 4 a.m. or 4 p.m.? I would have to say, Connor, you're the young one. You go out often. Would you say it's cool?
Yeah. I mean, it's cool, but yeah, it's not that practical.
How often do you wake up wondering if it's 4?
Especially in actually the more distinctive seasons like summer and winter, where at 5 o'clock in the morning or 5 o'clock in the afternoon it can be light at both times or it can be dark at both times in the winter. But I have to say that there wouldn't be too many times that I'd be waking up at 5.
And once you hit your 30s, it's never going to happen. So once you have my age, it's not a bother. Realistically, from a practical perspective, I really struggle to see much use to it. It sort of looks like a moon phase. I think that's the big selling point as well, and it's sort of dynamic on your watch. But realistically, you're never gonna wonder, is it 4 a.m. or p.m.
Would be handy for Brad Pitt in the Vampire Diaries.
That may
no,
be
not Vampire Diaries. Interview with a Vampire. That's the one.
I don't know. But okay, if you're a vampire or Johnny Depp or Brad Pitt or whatever, then you may have use for a day-night indicator. Practical reasons, I would say it's a 2. In terms of coolness, I'm a bit on the fence, in as much that it does look a bit like a moon phase, but it's not really a moon phase. So we sort of agreed on a 6. 6 for coolness, 2 for practicality. Speaking of moon phases, the real moon phase is another complication that I'll start off by showing you. There's an aperture in the dial, and it basically shows you the phase of the moon. And what it is with the moon phase is it's not a 31-day cycle. It's about a 29-day cycle. So it's sort of practical. It's not like every 13th of the month it's going to be full moon. It tends to shift. Well, it will shift. So it can be practical in a way that if you need to know when it's full moon, your watch can give you a good indication. Especially useful for werewolves, I believe.
Yeah, yes.
Generally, so if you're a werewolf, that's like a 10 out of 10 out of practicality scale.
I don't know what it is with watch innovators that seem to enjoy making things for mythical creatures and vampires. Well, soon Rolex will make some kind of announcement that they're working on like a coating which, if Medusa looks you straight in the face, you might turn to stone, but your Rolex won't.
That's great. I mean, the residual value on that one must be stellar. Now, it's literally like if you're in a nuclear war, you probably have some sort of Casio G-Shock that will withstand a nuclear blast. We have watches with perpetual calendars that will outlast you, unless you plan on being like 188 years old. That watch will continue giving the time. So watchmakers do tend to look at complications that may not be very practical. But your Rolex, I'm sure that they are listening and watching to this video, so who knows? But back to the watch itself and the moon phase complication. Moon phases are, I would say, they're very beautiful because you have watch brands do tend to put in a lot of effort into making the moon look really nice, and it's just a beautiful complication. It's not quickly moving because since it's 29 days. You really need to pay attention whether or not it has shifted during the night, but it's still a very cool complication. It's a good conversation starter. So in terms of practicality, unless you're a werewolf, then werewolf is going to be a 10 out of 10. For us, it's for normal people. In terms of practicality, unless you're like a meteorologist or something who really is bothered by that, or not bothered, has some use for it. Normal people, I would say, in terms of practicality, it's going to be a 3. In terms of coolness, however, I think it's a very cool thing. It's cool to show friends, like, oh, I've got a watch with a moon phase on it. It shows the actual phase of the moon. That's just cool. So in practicality, we're giving it a 8.5. I think that's cool.
Coolness, you mean?
Coolness, yeah.
You said practicality.
No, it's not practical at all. It's an 8.5 in terms of coolness. It's not practical. Then we're moving on to one that is not really typically, it's not one complication. So it's a bit of a, well, technically it shouldn't be in this video. It's a perpetual calendar. Well, what is different with a perpetual calendar and a regular calendar, like a regular date, moon date or day indicator, is that this does account for if a day has fewer than 31 days. Some watches even account for leap years. It will show you the month. It's just a whole package, and I've got a watch here that has a perpetual calendar. This is a rather higher end Frederick Constant with a perpetual calendar and even a moon phase on that, but we'll just gloss over the moon phase. And is this practical? Well, yes. This watch, if you keep it running, it will continue to show the correct day, date and month and even leap year until it stops. So if you have a watch winder, which you do tend to use, this sort of a watch you would generally put on a watch winder, because if you need to set it, it takes like 20 minutes to set it properly, especially with the moon phase. So this watch will always show you what day it is, and that is very practical because it combines all of the other complications into one and just makes it better. It's both practical and it's pretty cool. So in terms of practicality, it's a bit of a cheating one because it's not really one complication, it's several combined into one. But in terms of practicality, I would say it's an 8.5. It can't be more practical in terms of day and date indicators. And in terms of coolness, I mean, look at the watch. It has all sorts of hands and things are going on. It looks very complicated. So in terms of cool factor, I'm giving that a 7.5. Or, well, no, let's make it an 8. This watch is cool. It's an 8. And now the final one, the one we did save the most exciting one for last, which is the Tourbillon, which is a complication that is generally associated along with minute repeaters to be among the higher end complications. They tend to be on the more expensive watches. I don't think there's a Swiss made Tourbillon currently being sold for less than like 12,000 euros or 13,000 euros. So it's rather expensive and it's also pretty cool. So let me show you one because I've got one right here. This is again a Frederick Constant. Which combines a perpetual calendar with a tourbillon. And what happens with the tourbillon is that both the balance wheel and the escapement rotate in a 360 degree motion. So you see stuff moving around on your dial. It gives it a very dynamic look, and it's just rather complicated to produce. And what it does, it was originally designed to increase stability and accuracy. Now in these days with modern day watches, and it was originally also designed for pocket watches and not wristwatches, it doesn't really add anything anymore. So it's not like a Tourbillon watch will be more accurate than a regular watch with a normal balance and escapement. So there's no difference there. It just looks really exciting. It looks really exciting, it's cool, it's difficult to make, and it's expensive. The difficulty with this one is it doesn't really have a practical use, not in these days. I'm sure that there's some watch people that will disagree with that to some degree, but bottom line is that a Tourbillon watch is not more accurate by any means. It just looks really cool. So that one is very easy to score on both scales. In terms of practicality, it gets a solid 1.5. I'm just giving it a half point extra because I can. And in terms of coolness, I would say it's 9.5. It just looks really, really exciting, and it's the coolest, one of the coolest complications. It's also a complication that people will recognize, like watch geeks will recognize a Tourbillon, as opposed to say a minute repeater, which is also very exciting. We're not discussing the minute repeater, but that's something you can't really see. So this is one you can show off your watch geekness, and you can show off that you're very wealthy, and it's just cool. So to round this off, it's very personal, what is more practical for you. So the practicality scale is a bit subjective in as much we just assumed a more general position, what would apply to most people. If you're a werewolf, then obviously Moonface is going to be 10 out of 10. If you're not a werewolf, but because you're a mermaid, then it's not going to be very useful. And it's a bit personal, so we took a bit of a more general approach. And again, a watch is most practical when it combines several complications. That's the most exciting part. That's why I did sneak in the Perpetual calendar, for example, even though it's not a single complication. It's not like that particular thing is a loose thing. It's not, it's a combination of several factors that all work together. So that's why we didn't give any 10 out of 10s. And in fact, I'll leave the Perpetual calendar out of the complications competition. And I can say that in our opinion, the best complication would be the Chronograph, for being both practical, very cool, and not particularly fonzy. So go for a Chronograph if you want the best complication if you're just starting out. Thank you so much for watching. I fully realize that this video may not be especially interesting for you if you already know all the complications or you're not really interested in practicality scales and stuff, but I still hope you enjoyed the video. If you like the content, please subscribe, and if you have any comments, if you violently disagree, if you're an angry werewolf, just leave a comment below. Thank you.